of trying to talk about her strong feelings with her family, and that was very hard to do. So we often avoid noticing those feelings, or we deny that we have them. And that is not healthy for anybody. Since we have a number of new folks joining us, I'm going to pause right here before we start, Tony and I start the conversation, and go back to our renaming convention so people can do that as we move into the conversation. So we're asking everybody in the group to rename yourselves by adding a number in front of your name, the very first thing in your name box. So a number 1 if you are researching enslaved ancestors, a number 2 if you're researching enslaver ancestors, and a number 3 if your focus is more on learning the history of slavery and not so much on family history. And you'll find those instructions repeated in the chat. So, my friend Tony, it's time for us to enjoy some more conversation, to my great pleasure. I know you and I have talked about these emotions together, and I always learn something from listening to you. So I'd like if you could start us off by remembering back to when you first started doing your family history research and the genealogical inquiry. What kinds of feelings came up for you in those days?
Just anger. It's they got away with everything. There is no accountability. And I had to research the enslaver to find out about what happened to my family. I had to read about all their so-called successes. They were heroes. They got rid of the Native Americans in the land and, in different places. I had to read all of this just to get hopefully an inkling of what happened to my family. So it was like the crime was just up in my face, and the privilege, their feelings of privilege was up in my face, and they just like erased us. And that's what really came up for me in the beginning, and it still comes up for me, but I just know how to deal with it better now.
Okay. And do you tend to, is there somewhere in your body that you feel anger, or it feels some sort of certain way when you have it?
In my heart. I find myself grieving, because one of the ways I deal with my anger is to write and to read, and I take this research, and right now I'm writing on another book, and I'm writing about my family, and it's the grieving. When I go to bed at night, it's like, wow, in my heart, I'm just grieving about something that I uncovered. And my family, this part of my family, my grandfather was born in 1863. At the end of 1863, Emancipation Proclamation had been at the beginning of 1863, and he was still enslaved. He and his 6 or 7 other siblings, and they were enslaved by the man who fathered them. The enslaver was their father. And so my mother, who was born in 1914, heard a lot of stories because this was her father.
Yeah.
And my mother lived to be almost 103, and she was quite with it. But as she got older, as she aged, she was so sensitive to this, what had happened to her family and the history of slavery. But when I moved in with her, I brought all my pictures that I had in my hallway, and they were a picture of her grandmother, who was Violet, who was brown skin, and a picture of Violet's children, 6 or 7 children, which included my grandfather, and their pictures. And I just thought, wow, I was always proud that they had made it, that they had survived slavery. And so people would come over and visit, and they would say, who were these people? And one day we had a care, someone, like a care giver who would come when my mother got to be close to 100. And she asked, who are these pictures? Who are these people? And my mother described them. Clearly, you can see that Violet's picture was taken somewhere way back in maybe the 1800s. She's born in 1828. And then these are her children who look like me or lighter than me. And so after that question was asked, I asked my mother, what's wrong? She was upset. She said, because I don't know what they think. It's so obvious that those children were made by a white man. And what do they think? Did they think that my grandmother got raped? Clearly, the history is obvious up on the wall. And I told my mother, I said, look, I have those pictures up in my hallway because I was proud that they had survived. But that's the way you have to look at it. You can't look at it through wondering about appearances. Because, some people, see, my mother's generation, born in 1914, think that slavery is kind of stigmatized. And so I just, the way I looked at things were kind of, very sensitive. I looked at it very differently. I'm next generation, we survived. I looked at it very differently from my mother. And I remember she told me a story. She said, my father came home one day. He was in his 60s. And she said he slammed his hand on the desk. She said he had just gone to apply for Social Security. And he said, do you know they had the audacity to ask me what my mother's maiden name was? He said, slaves didn't have maiden names. And so my mother would hear these stories frequently. And so that had affected her sensitivity.
Yeah, for sure.
And
Tony, thank you.
And so I have some questions to ask you.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Okay. So what emotions came up for you when you began to research? Because you have a very interesting lineage, very interesting history.
Well, the first emotion that I actually remember goes way back to when I was, 9 or 10 or 11. And I was learning about my white ancestors, my enslaver ancestors, and the places they lived and, the things they did back in the day. And, but little by little, I began to figure out, but they owned slaves. They had slaves who worked at these places we're visiting. And I got very curious. So my first reaction was, I want to know more about this. And a little suspicion that maybe the white folks telling all these stories were leaving things out. Not quite telling everything, but I got curious. And that has stayed with me, which I think is a good thing. Quite a few years later, there came a point where a lot of linked descendants attended the meeting of the white side of the family, and it got really ugly and unpleasant. And my white family was disrespectful, rude, racism running rampant. And there were reporters present because it was considered a event of interest. And I was so embarrassed. That was the time when I felt really ashamed. I didn't feel particularly ashamed for myself. I felt ashamed for my family that they were being so ugly in in public, and it was going in the newspaper. So a lot of people were going to see it. And I did have the shame of, ooh, I'm going to be associated with these people. And ooh, I don't, ooh. And that was hard. That was a hard time. I did get through that, and in a way, I guess, transformed it into anger, and started, the more that I learned, so following that curiosity and learning more information, the more that I learned, the more opportunities there were to be really angry at my enslaver ancestors. So, you know, I'm meeting my linked descendants, forming relationships with them, becoming, in some cases, very dear friends, and realizing that they're only here because my ancestor raped their ancestor. Wow. And I had this fantasy, a wish, that I could have gone back in time and protected her. You know, sort of that. So it was that kind of protective anger. And I felt that again when I heard a story about how the same enslaver had a nail making factory, you know, little boys, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old boys that worked in the nail making factory. And they all had each little boy had a quota. And if he didn't meet his quota on any given day, they would beat them on the backs of their legs.
Right.
And boy, did my hair go on fire about that. And I wanted to go back in time and protect those little boys, just whip them away in the speed sense of the word, not any other sense, you know, get them out from the hands of that ugly enslaver. And when I found out that a different ancestor had not only been a slave trader, but had ended, his business came to an end when he got a note. And I've seen a facsimile of this handwritten note. Half the cargo was lost. And it took me a minute to absorb that and then realize that meant 100 to 150 Africans abducted from their homes had died in the voyage between West Africa and Richmond. And I'll say a little more later about my reaction, but that's one of the angriest moments I've ever had in my life, was coming across that information. So plenty of occasions to move shame into anger, and then get energized to keep learning. I also had that grief that you talked about, Tony, where I was doing an overnight in a slave dwelling with Joe McGill's group, and it was the Friday of Mother's Day weekend. So we were talking about mothers, enslaved women as mothers. And when I lay down that night, I thought about the enslaved woman brought from Africa, the one enslaved woman whose story I know from that far back. And she was raped on the voyage by the ship's captain. So here she is, this young pregnant woman delivered into this just completely strange place. And before long, she's delivering a baby, and her mama's not there, her aunties aren't there, whatever traditional healer midwife would have been there was absent. And I grieved for her. I grieved for that, being alone and in this strange place and going through such a huge experience by herself. So I think there are a lot of emotions that can get caught up together as we do this work.
Absolutely. The last thing I'll say is that my great-grandmother Violet showed up in the slave schedules.
Mm-hmm.
Only her, but then there's a 9-year-old Black girl. I don't know. I don't know if that was her daughter.
Yeah.
But the enslaver, who turns out to be my biological great-grandfather, William Payne Wallingford owned a 9-year-old girl and my great grandmother when she was about 22, 23. And the record's erased, but they talking about what you're saying, how they split up families.
Yeah,
And 9-year-old girl have no idea to this day who her mother was.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you,
Thank
Tony,
you.
for this conversation. And I'm going to share my screen a minute to summarize a few things about these difficult emotions that we've been considering. So anger is intense and takes different forms, from protective anger to outrage to, you know, a lot of different ways that we feel, or different kinds of anger we feel. And as the Linked Descendants group was putting this together, we wanted to really convey how valid and important and appropriate anger can be. White culture in this country tends to discourage people from expressing anger. We want to say we feel it's really valid, certainly in the context we're talking about, and that it has the possibility of being a source of energy. Shame is very different. You know, it's silent. We tend to hide it away. And an important aspect of shame is that we feel shame because we think we're being judged, and we are ashamed because it's about our beingness, that we are bad, not that we did something bad, but we are bad. So it can be really deep and painful. And in our conversations, we've found that some people feel shame because of what was done to their ancestors, and other people may feel shame because of what was done by their ancestors. But in either case, it can be that very held inward feeling of shame. And what we're going to do now is, if Allison and Sally tell me that they're ready, Libby is going to introduce the breakout activity, and I'm going to make sure she has a PowerPoint to share with you. So here we go, Libby.
Okay. All right, so we're gonna break out. We're gonna try to put everybody in pairs, but there might be 3 people in a couple groups. We want to make sure that you're named with the number. You're going to be with a similar person in your group who has the same number. And if you do not want to be in the group, in a breakout group, don't name yourself. But if you do, and you haven't renamed yourself with the number 1, 2, or 3, and Allison, if you could just put that in the chat one more time so everybody can see it. And just choose one number, please, because that's a number we will use to put you with a partner. And when you go into the room, you're going to have about 12 minutes, and each person will have about 5 minutes or so to talk. We're going to put you in pairs, and we want you to answer these questions one person at a time. Talk about, when did you feel shame or anger when you were researching? Where were you? What you were doing? Try to paint a picture and really feel back into it if you're comfortable with that. What caused the emotion? What did it feel like physically? And what were you saying or thinking to yourself? You know, even sometimes those whispers to yourself that aren't the loudest voice, but what were you saying that may have been causing the feelings? So about 12 minutes total, 5 minutes per person or so. And please give your full attention to the other person that's talking. Hold space for them, and no advice, no fixing, you're just listening. And everything that is shared is confidential. We're turning off the recording. Doesn't record breakout groups anyway, but we're turning it off. And yeah, so we're gonna send you in. Let's just double check that nobody needs to be renamed. We'll just look at the list. I think we're ready. Sally, are you ready to send people? And if you don't want to go into a room with a partner, you can just stay in the main room here. Okay, so close your eyes and off you go. Much time is left. Oh no.
What?
No,
There's
no,
still
I'm
3
sorry.
unassigned. Hello, everyone. We are now going to I'm going to interview a panel of people about their approaches for moving through these strong emotions of shame and anger, and the range of tools that they use for working with these feelings. And you've seen our group before: Allison, me, Libby, Tony, and Prinny, and I'll be interviewing all the others. Okay, so we'll start with Tony. Tony, can you join me on the camera? Okay, good. Hi, Tony. I enjoyed your discussion with Prinny about the reactions you've had doing your family research. And so I was wondering, obviously you were very, very angry, and maybe you still are very, very angry about your ancestor. How did you decide that you needed to give up that anger or do something else with it?
Well, it was like eating me up inside. I go to bed thinking about it. It just kind of, and so I decided that I would, because I am a writer. Well, you don't have to be a writer, but you can journal. I mean, I just started writing about it, and I just researched them so I could give them a voice. And so I started writing articles about what had happened to my family, specifically, certain people. And then I started making presentations in couple of the genealogy societies. And that just kind of, gave me some peace. And one of the things that used to make me so angry was they don't even know that we exist. The white part of of the enslaver family, who I am biologically related to, they don't even know that there's, they don't know that we are there. And so I had a genealogist help me in the very beginning when I started research, and I said, I want to find the Wallingfords. And so because I heard this oral history when I was a little girl, my uncle told me clearly who the enslaver was and who my grandfather's father was. And I said, I need to find the Wallingfords. And so we advertised on a genealogy board. Anyone here on, because those genealogy boards are on Ancestry and other places. Does anyone here know this particular Wallingford family? And someone answered. He said, I married into that family. He said, but they don't have any idea that slavery existed in their family. And so he introduced us. And so now I have 2 linked descendants. And they were shocked, and they were furious about how they had been told to idolize William P. Wallingford. That's who we're talking about. And they all grew up in the same place in DeKalb, in Missouri, but they had no idea that slavery existed. And so they were shocked, upset, but they said, next time you come to Missouri, would you stay with us? And I did. And it's been a 10-year relationship. And that is healing. That's really helped me a lot. And they read all my writing. We talk back and forth. And that really, for me, is a blessing. And then I could convey to my mother, who is pretty bitter about this, this history, how warm they were and how they wanted to meet her. And so, it's like
Oh.
it's like you open this big steel door with a lock on it. And once you open it, you go inside. Oh, it's all this history and they're a part of it. And it's just wonderful. It's, I'm glad I did it. And
Wow.
it's helped me, all this has helped me heal, And there's a
Uh-huh.
tape, by Louise Hay on anger. I'm going to put it in the chat. And what I
Uh-huh.
did was it's very personal, but this is how she meditates.
Uh-huh.
And I took my 3 great white grandfathers and used them. You use the people you're angry with, and you're talking to them, and you're trying to get rid of all this anger.
Right.
And
Right.
actually, when I finished the tape, I inched a little bit more towards forgiveness. So I put it in the chat.
Okay. That's so interesting that you were able to calm it sounds like you were able to calm yourself down, and also you enlarged your version of who the family was, and you
Yes.
enlarged their version of who the family was. You told a more complete version of who the family is.
Absolutely.
Oh,
You know,
that's terrific.
It's
Well,
really, really nice.
yeah. Thank you so much. Let me move on to Libby. Sorry to leave you behind here
No,
for a
I'm
moment.
sorry.
No. Okay, Libby.
Mhm.
I have
Hi.
heard you talk about intense shame that you have felt. And
Mhm.
so could you tell me about what made you realize you needed to address these feelings, and the steps you've been taking to get out of the shame, how you've been
Mhm.
dealing with it?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't sure it was shame at first. I wasn't aware of my shame triggers. I didn't even call it that for a good long while. I know now that I go into what Brene Brown calls a shame spiral when I'm doing research on my ancestors and their relationship to slavery. And for me, it tends to show up as perfectionism, a disconnection from what my body needs. I cut myself off at the head and just let my brain run everything. I deny my emotions. I tell myself I don't have a right to be upset. I plow ahead no matter what, right? So I needed to develop skills to spot that shame was running me, that had taken over, because it can creep in little whispers. I ended up making myself ill. I pushed myself too hard. I don't sleep. I have a hard time being with the anxiety and grief and rage. And so that's one tool that we can use, is to notice if shame is covering up more difficult emotions, especially powerlessness, rage, grief. And in the beginning, it was also the tears that made me realize I needed to address the feelings of shame and get a better handle on them. The tears didn't come when I was alone doing research. I was too shut down. I was too busy doing and researching and figuring things out. So I was storing all of these big feelings and I was not letting them out. But they came out in group settings when it wasn't appropriate for me as a white woman, a white person at all, to be crying about things. I didn't think I was centering myself. I tried to, be discreet about it, but I still was coming to those settings with a lot of intense energy because so much was built up inside of me. And then for tools, number one was to know in advance that shame was going to get triggered and set up a container for my research work. So that looks like setting a timer, because I can go for hours and ignore what my body needs. So I set a timer and try to get up every so often, walk away, take care of my body with extra nutrition when I'm doing research, know what it's going to look like, because once it's happened, I'm blind to it. So number one, knowing that I'm going to be triggered. Number two, being familiar with what it looks like and how it shows up. And then number three is remembering to name it. So call it shame rather than dedication, obsession, perseverance, determination. It's shame that's running me. And I need to just keep reminding myself that. And then the fourth tool is empathy. So Brene says that the antidote to shame is empathy. And since I'm the one that's alone when I'm doing this research, I'm the one that needs to muster up some kindness for myself. I have a lot of critical voices inside that say I don't deserve kindness. What I'm experiencing is nothing compared to those that I'm researching experience. My ancestors were the one that perpetrated the violence. I deserve this feeling. So I have to kind of override those voices, not wallow in the feelings, not let them stop me from continuing to take action, but be truthful with myself about the fact that I'm having these feelings. So that might look like touching my chest when I feel physical sensations and say, this is really hard. I know, let's take a little break, or this is shame. It feels toxic and horrible. It's really tough to look at. And reminding myself I can slow down because we're not going to get to the end of the road today, not even in my lifetime. So I don't let it stop me, but I also don't pretend it's not happening. And then the last thing is to get support processing the shame and the overwhelm. So I do that in my affinity group of Linked Descendants, one-on-one with them, because they know what it's like. Other people in my life don't understand.
Mhm.
And then just a couple other little things I want to throw in, and that is to learn to separate our ancestors from us, to really work on strengthening the boundaries there, that we are not our ancestors. Clear the shame out. Otherwise, we're putting a very heavy burden on those that we're trying to interact with, our linked descendants, anyone we're trying to provide records to. We need to manage all that and deal with it so we're not putting it on them. And then the very last thing, I learned this in a class, that rather than being fully immersed in the history when we're researching it, as I still tend to do sometimes, that we prepare ourselves for the journey. Even when we're just going to look on Ancestry for documents, we prepare ourselves with a crystal, a talisman, a feather, whatever we have that's meaningful to us, and that we look through a window into history, not be back there in history, but just looking at it. So thank you.
Thank you, Libby. I share one or more of your same tendencies, so I identify heavily with what you're describing. We'll move on, I think, now to Prinny. Is Prinny next? I think so.
I think so. Yeah, here
Prinny.
I am right there with you.
Prinny, you have the advantage of having done this work for a lot longer than some. So maybe have acquired a little emotional distance from it that some of us are still searching for, to get that emotional distance. So what has been, or over the years, what have been your approaches to cope with your feelings of shame, anger, or any other intense emotions around this work?
Yeah. In terms of of anger, I do still feel angry, but I don't feel as angry as I did the day I discovered how my 5 times great-grandfather's slave trading business came to an end. And I was sitting in a chair reading, and I read this story and saw the facsimile of the document. And I remember feeling red hot. Just my hair was on fire. I was infuriated, and the anger came welling up in me. And I was prepared to throw this big, fat, heavy history book right out through the closed window. And the tool that I now call pull off the road and get grounded was something, maybe pause just a second and go, if you break the window and the screen, you're going to be really upset about that, and you'll lose the book as well. So I threw it across the room instead, and it banged into the baseboard and made a very satisfying noise. And that was sufficient, but it kept me from going full bore. And so I've hung on to that. Hang on, pull off the road. Is this really what you want to do? Is there something else? So that's been helpful for anger. And as Libby said, with shame. So when I was feeling so ashamed of my family, my white family's behavior being public news, I had to really ask myself, okay, so this is all getting written up in the paper, but is there anybody who's actually going to come around saying, I'm looking for Prinny Anderson, that shameful person? And I was like, yeah, don't take yourself quite so seriously, Prinny. No, they're not. And it got easier to just step away and say, those are my ancestors who did the things that were shameful, that make me angry, and I am not them. And in fact, my job is to talk about them and talk about the shameful things they did and call them shameful. And step back and tell the story, tell the truth. So really, as Libby said, separating myself and setting up a boundary. So those have been some practices I've been able to use that have really helped. Thanks.
Thank you, Prinny. Thank you so much. And now finally over to Allison. And what I really admire about Allison is her ability to cut straight to the chase. We're not going to wallow in this stuff. We're going to fix it right now. So Allison, tell me how you got to this place where you're able to get so much done with your anger.
Well, and I'm going to pivot slightly because I think ultimately we need to take the shame and guilt and make it productive.
Yes.
That's part of it. It's when it's unproductive and makes us get stuck. And I'm going to give credit to Lottie Lee Beulah for the expression white dithering, which is we get so caught up in our emotions that we do not progress. So my second coming to the table meeting of all time was I went to after finding out that my sixth great grandfather was a slave trafficker, which was the lower than the low, than the low. I thought I'd hit bottom and I kept crashing through bottom and hitting another bottom. And it was the same week as the massacre in Charleston by Dylann Roof. So I listened to Obama's eulogy and collapsed in complete tears, sobbing that my family was part of an institution and they were back to colonial Virginia. They were part of codifying chattel slavery that resulted in these deaths. And I came to the coming table meeting and a couple hours later, and I described this experience. And one of the Black members of the group looked at me and said, "We feel that pain every day." And it really recentered my journey in a fundamental way right at the beginning, which is, yeah, that my family is part of creating a system that we live with every day. And it doesn't affect me in the same way as either people who were enslaved or people of color today who experience a lack of safety in daily life. And that's when I kind of flipped, and I'm always remembering to decenter my own whiteness in this journey. And I channel a lot of it into activism and repair and atonement and what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And people are always saying to me, "You're doing so much." It's like, oh, no, no, no. I have so much to make up for. This is just the beginning. So I think it's really important to get a handle on these emotions and get that support, decenter yourself so that you can move forward and not get stuck. It's all about not getting stuck.
Right. Well, thanks so much for those insights. And also to the other panelists who answered my question. And so I think we have a summary slide here to look at for a minute. So here's some of the tools we've been talking about. Our panelists have talked about the importance of recognizing and naming the shame, support and empathy for the shame, cross-examine the shame, and so on. These are tools for moving through the shame and the anger, whether you need to pull off the road or accept that you are really pissed off, but still pull off the road. The point is to get to the point where you can get to the action at the end. We've got to be ready to take the action. So I'd like to thank our panelists and thank you all for listening to this presentation today. And let's see what's next.
I think
Oh,
Tony is going to.
Oh, it's Tony. I'm to turn over to Tony now, who's going to lead us through our next activity. Sorry about that, Tony.
And let me just say to everyone, there is a very large handout associated with this workshop that goes into all of these tools in a lot of depth, and that will be sent to you along with the video of this session. where you'll have access to it along with the video. And I think we're going to put the link to it in the chat at the end of the session as well. So there's a whole lot more you can have if you need it. So now, Tony.
Oh, okay. So we're going to spend about 5 minutes. We kind of want to commit to moving through shame or anger, or both, if you feel both. You know, we're not going to break up into groups. It's just an individual thing about what you're going to do for your health, for your, you know, I guess could say mental health, about moving through, you know, some of these challenges regarding anger or shame or both. And so if we could just spend about 5 minutes and you could list the tools, make a plan for yourself. I mean, about what you will do, when to do it, when do you need to do this, and keeping yourself on track, accountable. It's a benefit. It's keeping a commitment to ourselves. So spend about 5 minutes doing it, and then you can put it in chat if you feel like sharing it.
And just as a reminder, here is that list that Angela was talking about a minute ago, and we'll leave that up to help people think about what is it that would work for you.